Welcome to the Advantage Podcast, a monthly unscripted conversation with host David Ashcraft and top leaders impacting our world. Created by pastors for pastors to strengthen our leadership and expand our knowledge and influence.
Well, hi, guys. Welcome to the Advantage Podcast. And I have a special guest today that I'm excited for you to meet. I am here with Jenni Catron, and just excited to have her. And Jenni, good to have you here with us today. And so maybe let's start out just by having you tell a little bit about who you are in case folks aren't familiar with you and your background, but definitely somebody involved in church work and church leadership. And so
Yeah.
welcome. Glad to have you here.
David, thanks so much for the conversation. I appreciate just investing in leaders like you are and being so intentional to invest in pastoral leaders. My just kind of I'll try to make the story as brief as I can, but I say that I was born and raised, or I was raised in the church, but I really came to faith at the age of 8. And so I was old enough to know how much the impact of the local church and ultimately, salvation in Christ changed our family story. So I often say I was raised in church, but the reality is I have such a special place for the church and for ministry leaders because of how it impacted my family story. And so I jumped in just wholehearted into ministry, but never thought I'd be on ministry staff. I had this big, wild dream of working in the Christian music business. And so I went to college in Tennessee. I grew up in Wisconsin.
So were you a singer then? Is that what you thought you were going to do? Or are you?
You know, I can sing. I was in the choirs and all that, but I knew I wasn't really a performer. My
Okay.
spiritual gifts are knowledge and leadership and administration. And so I
Okay.
knew I could carry a tune, but I knew I wasn't
Yeah.
destined for performance.
Okay.
So I really leaned towards that business side, but I wanted to work for a Christian record company. Was able to do that. That was the first part of my career journey, was working
Mm.
almost 10 years for a company called Forefront Records, which
Okay.
was an absolute joy, amazing experience. And then my husband and I were part of planting a church in Nashville, a church called Crosspoint Church. And I thought I was going to be a good, faithful volunteer, who was just showing up and helping support this church plant. And 3 years in, it grew rapidly. And
Mm.
the pastor and the elders tapped me on the shoulder and said, would you come here and serve on staff? And I thought, what am I going to do in a church? But it quickly, God just really began to illuminate for me that my gifts are really to help put feet to a vision, that I love coming alongside great visionaries and helping them figure out how to align a team to accomplish that mission. And I clearly felt like I was like, I need you to use that gift in this context. So I went on staff at Crosspoint Church as executive director, and we were,
How big was the church at that time? Because you said it was 3 years old. So did it
yeah,
grow pretty quick? And
it did grow. We were about 500 at that time, meeting in a
okay.
school cafeteria. So, just, doing all the crazy setup, tear down. I think we were doing 4 services in a school cafeteria. I mean, it was just, and I'm sure many of the pastors listening have been there and done that. And I know you have, David. But
But let me ask you, Jenni, what's interesting. So you said you went on to be executive staff and you were a church of 500. So I enjoy strategic planning and things like that. So we didn't
yeah,
hire an executive staff member until we were well over 2000. And so sometimes churches that are smaller will talk about getting an executive staff. And I'm like, oh, no, you don't want to do that. And yet I realize that's my personality and my gift mix. And so you came on at 500, and it sounds like it must have been a positive thing for the church.
Yeah, that's a great observation, because I've noticed that in some of the work that I've done with pastors, is that I think it really does depend on the skill set and talents, gifts of that senior leader. You're much more of a strategic thinker. In the case of the church that I was a part of, they really recognized that our senior pastor was high visionary, teaching, shepherding, and the strategic side of it was not, as the organizational leadership side of it was not where he wanted to spend a lot of time and energy.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that was the awareness for him and the elders was, I think because of the growth trajectory, because that wasn't a passion point and a gift mix for him, that we took that step a little early. I was like the 5th staff member, so we probably um, sacrificed a few other hires in order to put me in that seat pretty early on. But you're right. Yeah, it was a little early for an executive role.
And yet it's real good for me to hear that because again, I tend to think everybody's got to have the same gift mix as I have. And so then I advise people that way. And then to realize now we're all mixed differently. And so
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be the way it happened for me. So
yeah.
that's a good thing to hear.
Yeah, well, and I think, I mean, David, you have such a unique set of gifts that I think, a senior pastor that can be a preaching pastor and, carry the visionary and the organizational leadership load. Like, that's just a unique mix that I think sometimes is challenging to find in one leader. And so I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
being able to acknowledge that, and I really credit our elders in that season of saying, hey, how do we best support? I mean, I remember our senior pastor's wife saying she remembers the ministry before and after me coming on board. And it wasn't because
Interesting.
of me, it was
Yeah.
because of that set of skills that came to the table that helped kind of, just bring a balance of gifts that I think helped lead the church forward. So we were about 500 in that stage, and we grew over the next 9 years from about 500 to 6,000. And we launched multi-site and went to several locations. And it was good, steady, steady growth. It wasn't
Yeah.
like, overnight we went from 500 to 5,000. It was like just that kind of that steady growth over the course of those years. But still, every year it was a different church and, we were growing and expanding and trying to figure it all out. So
So
yeah,
how did you do working with the senior pastor? So if he's more of a visionary, if he's strong, teaching, speaking,
yeah.
did you guys complement obviously you did complement each other. Did you struggle with each other because you were both different in your mindset, or how did that work?
We definitely had our places where we kind of, uh, had difficulty kind of we bumped heads, let's just say.
Yeah,
There were
yeah,
occasions where
exactly.
we just bumped heads on things because what
Sure.
we would prioritize is different. I have the privilege right now of being in an executive role at my home church, very part-time, because I get to do a lot of other work, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But similar dynamic, a high visionary leader that I'm working alongside. And what I love about it is that there's such a high value of the differences we bring. And that was the case back in Nashville. And it's the case now with the senior pastor that I'm working with, in that there's just a high value of, we know we bring different gifts to the table
Yeah,
and leaving room for that. So when those moments of tension or frustration, and that we're stopping and we're saying, okay, what are you seeing? I need to understand what you see from your seat. And each of us doing that. And the moments where we would do that well, where we would stop and we would just seek to understand each other, we would see that collectively we had a much better perspective on the whole of the ministry. But it didn't come without, and of course,
sure.
he's he's senior leader, so there were places where I absolutely had to submit to that, and there were places where I would lean in a little more and say, "Hey, there's really something I need you to be mindful of here because it's creating confusion for the team." And that was the thing, and we'll discuss this more, but I have such a passion for how to align the team and help ensure the team is equipped with what they need to succeed, that there were occasions where some of our biggest like pain points or challenging spots were really about me recognizing the team had some level of confusion and I really needed to be the bridge between the senior pastor and the rest of the team and ensuring we were all collectively moving forward together. And so that was
Yeah,
kind of always how I envisioned my role,
yeah.
was trying to help bring perspective that helped everybody move forward together.
That's good. And part of why I wanted to stop there and just talk about that, Jenny, is we as church staff, people come on and you hire somebody, you think it's all going to be blissful all the time. And oftentimes it is good, but oftentimes we struggle too. And so I appreciate you even saying that part of it was just recognizing we are different. We come from different perspectives, but together we can work. But it took recognizing that, admitting that, and then being willing to talk
That's
to
right.
kind of work through this.
Yeah, and there were challenging moments. There were challenging times of, and the thing for us, especially in Nashville, is none of us had led a church that size.
Yeah.
Myself, the senior pastor, any of our team, nobody had been in a larger church than we were leading at the moment. So we were all in over our head. so
Yeah. Yeah.
so there was a little bit of that just mutual appreciation for what each was seeing and honoring and respecting what each other was seeing, and then trying to figure out, okay, how do we move forward on this together? And there were points where I had to lean in and try to figure out how do I lead up in this and bring perspective that I think is really important. And sometimes I was right, and sometimes I wasn't right.
Yeah.
And so then having the humility to recognize that too, I could be really opinionated about something and then recognize that I had a blind spot, and that our senior leader was seeing, and I needed to be conscious of that. So
And I think, Jenny, one of the big takeaways is when we're working together with people, we're going to have different perspectives. That's going to
that's
happen.
right.
As I think sometimes we run into those conflicts and think, oh no, things are falling apart. Oh no, what's wrong? And
Right.
it may not be anything wrong, other than that's part of the process God uses to take us forward and figure out the path
Yeah.
forward that's best. So
Yeah.
yeah, good. So
Yeah.
9 years there at Crosspoint, and then what was your next step?
Yeah, I had the privilege of going and serving at Menlo Church out in Menlo Park, California for a couple years as executive pastor there, and different
And was
church.
that with John Ortberg then? Were you there
That
with
was
him?
with Yeah, I was there with John. I
Good.
met
Okay.
John at a global leadership summit,
Okay.
and shortly thereafter, the conversation just kind of flourished into he was looking for another executive pastor, and um, totally different dynamic in that I went from a church plant that was just scrappy and young and fast moving to going to a 140-year-old denominational church that,
Yeah.
much different environment, much different culture. And it was a really wonderful learning experience and a very different leader. So I went from
Sure.
the leader in Nashville was a very driven, entrepreneurial type of church planting leader, to John, who is a very thoughtful, spiritual formation, and that is how he leads and how he guides. So I would go
Yeah.
into his office, and I would have a list of, a zillion things we needed to talk about. And he would say, Jenny, how's your soul? I was like, hadn't thought about my soul yet today because I'm a get it done person
Yeah.
who comes in with my list. And David, I just say that I say it jokingly, but I say just the value of having a leader who also was conscious of my health
Yeah.
as just a follower of Jesus. It was a really unique gift in serving under John and his leadership in that.
That's great. We actually had John come and speak to the Advantage pastors
Awesome.
last year, and then he was a part of the podcast about a year ago. And so appreciate him.
That's so
He's
good.
doing a lot, very much.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
I mean, I still get to connect with John, but it was a really special gift to serve under his leadership for a season.
Yeah, very cool. So after Menlo Park, then
After Menlo Park, I launched the Foresight Group, which is the organization that I now lead. And it was really out of a heart. I was just continuing to have opportunities to speak, write, pour into other leaders, and so Foresight just kind of was birthed out of that of saying, okay, how can I help serve and support more leaders in their teams? My passion point through all of it, even going back to the record company, to Crosspoint, to Menlo Park, was what I really loved was helping make sure leaders were well equipped, that leaders need to be healthy and thriving because so goes the leader, so goes the team. And then the dynamic of a team that is really aligned and working effectively together. I just found so much joy in that.
that's good.
And I had been a part of both. I'd been a part of teams that, it felt like quicksand. You couldn't get anything done. Nobody was working together. Everybody's doubling down into their silos. And then I was a part of teams where it was like they were in it together. They were committed. They understood their roles, responsibilities, what everybody did. They understood the mission, and they were just clearly committed to making that happen. And I thought, gosh, it is so much more enjoyable to lead when
Yeah,
you have a team like that. And so if I could help leaders and teams thrive, because ultimately the mission is so critical. That's why Foresight was started, and that's what the work that we get to do.
that's cool. So part of the way you and I engaged even recently, you've written a new book, and it's all about church. Well, I say it's about leadership, but it's about church culture and
Yes.
staff culture. And so describe the book a little bit. I had opportunity to read an advanced copy of it. Love the book,
Yes. Thank
Jenny,
you.
and very
Thank
excited
you.
about it. So much so that I invited Jenny to come and speak at what we call Base Camp for the Global Leadership Network in February. And all of you guys are invited to come and be a part of Base Camp as well. But Jenny will be there and talking about culture. But maybe describe a little bit about the
Sure.
genesis of the book, and then let's talk about church culture or staff culture. So,
Yeah. 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 David, this really was the culmination of so many years of just trying to figure out what do great what do great teams do, and what do leaders do who build great teams, right? So, if I trace my story, when I was at the record company, I was initially a part of just a phenomenal team. I didn't even know. I was in my early 20s, just out of college. I had no idea that I got dropped into a organization with great leadership and great culture. And so it was
So it
all I
must always
knew.
like that, huh?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what every
Yeah.
job is like, right? And 8 years later, we were merged with another division of the company. And overnight, my experience as an employee went from amazing to awful. Like,
Mm,
I had loved going to work every day, and all of a sudden, I just loathed it.
mm.
And I spent about a year in the merged company, really out of respect for one of my previous leaders who had said, "Jenny, would you give it a year?" Just really wanting me to give it my best shot. And
Yeah.
um, so I did. And then that was when I was invited to come on staff at Crosspoint. And I remember very vividly this recognition that now I was going in as a senior leader in the organization, small team, but either way, I had disproportionate influence over the experience we were creating, both for our staff and really our volunteers, and then the congregation as a result.
Mm.
And I just became so burdened by that, David, that I was like, I now sit in a seat where I am going to shape the experience that our staff have, our volunteers have, and that is going to be how people experience our church.
Mm.
And so I just began studying and reading and just devoting myself to saying, what does it look like, and how do you define it? How do you protect it? How do you steward it? And so
And
the
did you even know it was culture back then, or that probably was the
no,
least of your thoughts is this is culture? So, yeah,
yeah, I wouldn't have even put that word on it. I
yeah.
just knew that, like, I didn't want the teams that I was leading to have the experience that I had had
Mm,
previously.
mm.
And I wrote this kind of mantra. I wish I had it, like, readily available, but when I went from marketplace to ministry, I wrote this mantra of how I felt like the church should be the most inspiring place to be a part of. It should utilize people's gifts. We should be able to deploy our gifts for the good of the kingdom. And I just wrote this, like, two-page thing in a little red journal of my vision for what the experience should look like for everybody who's a part of a local church. And it really should be the lighthouse to every organization around it. And you won't be surprised by this, but I was surprised as I got into church ministry and began to see that in a lot of other church cultures, the experience for employees was sometimes horrible.
Yeah.
And as much as we're about people in ministry, oftentimes, I often will tell pastors, your staff are your first congregation. They're your first line of care. They're the first team to support, to invest, to pour into, to ensure they are healthy and thriving because they're impacting the rest of the
Yeah.
congregation. And I just realized there was this gap that I think we were missing that, and that we thought that because we're relational, just our relational hearts would solve a multitude of sins. And what
Yeah.
I began to discover is that we really needed to be more intentional and thoughtful. And ultimately, in the book, I talk about a culture operating system that, just like every other key initiative in your ministry, you have a strategy for your outreach, you have a strategic plan for your mission in general. You've crafted purpose, mission statements and vision statements, and you've spent time and energy and resources. But have we built a plan for the stewardship of our people?
Yeah, no, it's good. And can I go back to one thing you said? I think when you started, you said part of why you wrote that mantra was because you didn't want the church culture to experience what you had experienced in that transition. And so oftentimes we'll go through a negative experience or a negative time in our ministry and we'll think, oh, what was that about? I know for
Yeah,
myself, similar to you, it was things that I didn't like growing up about church that caused me to do church the way we did it for the
yeah,
last 35 years. And you had an experience that was maybe negative, but God was able to use that to say, okay, but now let's figure out how to do things in a positive way moving forward. And so I think it's learning from those times that aren't always as positive as we would like them to be and say, okay, what's God teaching me here so
that's
that it
right.
doesn't continue that way. So I think that's cool to see that.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like those are always my best learning moments, right? Is like
Yeah.
the hard one. As much as you try to avoid the challenges or the difficult seasons, it's like, gosh, if the opportunity in that is so
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Because again, it was so distinct, the experience. And I just thought, I just have such a heart for stewarding the talent that God brings to us. And that's really the way, like, I look at it. Again, David, the irony of all of it is that I'm a firstborn A-type overachiever who loves to be a lone ranger. And the fact that God has me in a place now where I'm so passionate about the responsibility that leaders have, and so committed to how to invest and develop healthy teams.
Yeah,
It's just
that's good.
ironic because it's so counter to my nature.
Yeah,
And but you see the experience of it, and you just recognize and I really do see culture as a stewardship responsibility,
yeah,
that the team that God has assembled for us in this season is just a unique combination of individuals with different gifts and skills and talents and experiences, and the opportunities that God has given our church. And in this case, you talking to so many pastors, the unique opportunity that God has given your church in the season that you're in with this team of people assembled, is the uniqueness that is shaping the culture you have. But
yeah.
your intentionality in that is the distinctiveness.
So you talk about being intentional. What are some keys then to developing a healthy team and just working together in a way that's productive, but also isn't detrimental to the individual? So describe what a healthy team looks like, and how do you even get there?
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, I think we could rattle off a lot of things that we'd say, yeah, we want that to be true of every team. But my conviction is, I think every leader needs to define, who are we? So my definition of culture is who we are and how we work together to achieve our mission. So it's not, sometimes we hear culture and we think, it's kind of kumbaya, like it's the perks and the frills and the fun stuff. And we get a little annoyed by that as leaders because we want to, get the mission done.
Yeah, yeah,
And those things can be a part of culture, but culture is really that clarity of, who are we? Like, who are we as a church? What is the mission? What is the vision? What is the distinctiveness about who we are and where God has placed us? Like, what are we called to? Who we are, how we work together, whether the values, the beliefs, the behaviors that inform how we show up as a team. And it's ultimately in achievement of that mission, right? Because it doesn't, we're not a social club. We're a team on a mission. There's a mission that God has given us. And so starting with that definition of, first, you're likely pretty clear about who you are, mission, vision, um, uh, who you're called to reach, in your community. But then how we work together, that's usually the piece that we haven't defined. Leaders know it instinctively. And David, it'd be fun to kind of like even workshop with this with you, going back 35 years and saying there were probably really distinctive things about that were important to you as a leader when you launched LCBC. Like, it was like,
yeah,
this is how we work together. And in the early days, you're mostly, the people around you are catching that, right? Like, they're just catching what matters to you, what's important to you, just the values that guide you, whether you've articulated those or not. So they're there. The challenge is that there comes a point where people don't have the level of proximity to just catch that from you as the senior
yeah,
leader.
yeah,
And what most leaders have failed to do, I had a church that I've worked with on and off for about 7 years. Amazing church, amazing leader. Um, but what we were finding is, as I was doing some work with his team, is that he had values that were just very instinctual to him, like just really core to him. But they were a church of several thousand at this point. And the frustration was, a staff person would make a decision or take action, and the senior pastor would redirect it. They're frustrated, he's frustrated. And what I began to find is that they were making a decision that wasn't aligned with some of his core convictions or core values, but he had never articulated those to them. So they were
mm,
kind of guessing at what to do or how to do it, and thought it was a good decision, but they didn't understand, the core of what was leading and guiding him. And so that's the starting point for me, is getting really clear as a leader or a leadership team. If you're founding leader, your ministry is very much shaped by the things that you value and you hold important. If you've inherited, like when I went to Menlo Park, we're a 140-year-old church. There have been several senior pastors through the years. There were values that had shaped that culture that even eclipsed, the things that were important to John. John is the senior pastor in that era. Of course, his values were guiding our leadership, but there were other things that were still core to the culture that we needed to understand and carry forward to help define our culture. So that's the starting point. And I know we've all heard about, we need values. but there's the distinctiveness of going deeper to say, why does that matter? Why? And that's not just the values that you think should be on the list of character, integrity, humility, we're all agreeing to those. But there are other things that are really core convictions, like self-leadership is a core conviction to me, that I have to lead myself well to lead others better. That's a core value to how Foresight operates, is that we really are committed to how are we leading ourselves? How are we investing in our growth and our health? Well, that's a core conviction. If somebody's on my team and they're not aligning with that self-leadership value, if they're not demonstrating a commitment to continue to learn and grow, they probably won't survive well in our culture. And so
Yeah.
every leader has to dig for those, really mine for what are those handful of things that are really distinctive to us that set us apart from another ministry across town.
And
Um,
Jenny, you said earlier you used the word proximity, and so I think
mm,
what happened for us is, again, when you're small, the people around you, they figure out what those things are that you value because they're with you enough that you
totally.
can pick those up. The problem is as you grow and people don't have that same proximity to you, then that's where it starts breaking down, right? And so
Yeah.
that's where you have to
Yeah.
get more intentional about it even.
Yeah. Did you have a season like that, David, for you? Like as you reflect back on the LCBC's journey where you had to get much more distinct about what was important?
Yeah, I think so. Right off the bat, we started doing what we called newcomers classes back then, and now we call them first time I think first steps. And so we would teach this is who we are, this is what we're doing, here's how we operate. And I would even say, and if you don't want to operate this way, that's totally okay. There are other churches that are operating differently than
That's right.
us, but this is the way we operate here. And so if you want to go somewhere else, that's fine. And so we still do that today. And I think that
Good.
helped us kind of define again, these
Yeah.
are the parameters so that you can operate in here at LCBC. And I didn't know
Yeah.
it was culture then. I didn't even know I don't know what I knew, but they've really
But
kind of
you,
set for us the track that we're on. So
yeah. Yeah. Well, and I love that. And you kind of teased out something that I think is also important in a ministry context in that there's the importance of doing that for the church culture of like, hey, what's the mission, the vision, the values that guide. I love how you said it, like this is who we are and how we're going to carry out the ministry of this church. But and that may or may not be a great fit for you, but there's clarity in that, which one of my just convictions is that clarity is the chief indicator of the health of a culture. So leaders have to fight for that clarity of like, how can I give people a level of clarity that helps them understand how to how to win here, how to join us in the mission we're a part of. And then I think there's another layer of, and I think you all have done this as well, is those values that are true for the congregation, for the church at large. And then there's another set of values that I often encourage churches to have is the set of staff values of like, okay, now here's how we work together because now we're giving the best hours of our day. It's our primary, it's our work experience along with our ministry experience. And what I often find is there's just, I'm looking over here because I have a set of nesting dolls that I often will grab and show that like it's like the larger nesting doll is the mission and vision of the church, and then the church values sit inside of that, and then the staff values sit inside of that. So they've all got to be aligned. It's all got to be congruent. But you're going a layer deeper to say, hey, now that you're a part of staff, there's even a deeper level. There's another set of values that are core to how we work together. One of the ones that we had back at Crosspoint, and that's when I really started working out the framework that I outline in the book is like I
yeah,
was actively like working this out with a team that was growing rapidly. And we had a value of collaborative communication. Now, that doesn't sound terribly exciting, but what was happening is we were now moving into multi-site. We were about to launch our third location. And any of the leaders who have done are doing multi-site church know that communication breaks down in every which way, as
yeah,
in any type of growth, but particularly in multi-site, it was like we were just failing in communication on every level. And we paused and said, okay, this is one of the values we need to elevate in its importance for us as a team. And what's the belief behind that? The belief is that communication is an act of respect to our coworkers. That every one of us was feeling disrespected because we weren't getting the right information at the right time, and it was hindering us from doing good work. And so we said that's the belief behind it. Well, what are the behaviors? Like, so this is where we went deeper in the definition of the value to help our team really grasp it and understand
mhm,
and really guide their work. We said, okay, well, what are the behaviors? Well, if we just ask three questions: who needs to know, What do they need to know? And when do they need to know it? If we just ask those three questions of each other, we're going to increase our communication pretty quickly. If I'm about to make a decision in kids ministry over here, I need to think, who needs to know this? Okay, the other locations need to know this. What do they need to know specifically? And when? And as soon as I ask myself those questions, it slows me down enough to make sure I'm equipping my coworkers effectively. And so we just went through that exercise, and then we put sticky statements on them. Our sticky statement for that one was use your blinker, because I was known for my efficient driving style. I like to get things to get places quickly. And it was kind of a running joke inside of our staff culture. And I said, but if you notice, I religiously use my turn signal, because if you're going to move fast, if you don't communicate, you're going to crash. And that was the thing that kind of illuminated the power of collaborative communication, which was, everybody's like, yeah, of course, we need to communicate well. But everybody got the visual of that, and they understood, especially the belief of like, it's an act of respect. Like, it's respecting my coworkers to make sure I communicate well. So
That's great.
I share all of that because it's the framework that starts to give values more stickiness than just phrases we put on the wall. And that's when
Yeah.
our team begin to live into them.
Exactly. A couple things you said that I like. One, I love the fact that you said use your blinker. I think that must be a Southern thing. I call it a blinker, and then people make fun of me in Pennsylvania for calling it a blinker. And what's that?
Uh-huh.
So I love that terminology. And I think too, Jenny, what happens as we grow as organizations, communication oftentimes is the first thing that breaks down.
For sure.
And especially like you said, multi-site. A number of our churches are doing multi-site, and boy, that's where it starts popping up more than ever. And so that's where these values, the proximity starts further and further away from you as the leader.
That's right.
And so I love the just simplicity of your three statements there of communication. But it also means at that point you've the complexity gets bigger and bigger, harder and harder, and yet you have to simplify and get down to those
Yeah.
basic things like how do we talk to each other, and how do we
Yeah.
make sure we communicate with one another? I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I just found that's the thing, that it's a tool that's in the framework, is we just call it the values grid. But that digging into, okay, what's important to us, but then why and how, and what are the stories or the language that we can use to help it kind of just connect deeper to our team. It
Yeah,
just begins to give a level of clarity and simplicity. Because the funny part is, nobody remembers all of the little nuances. They just remember the phrase, use your blinker.
yeah,
And I still will get emails from some of the staff that I worked with back in that day who will say, hey, using my blinker, thought you'd love to know this.
that's good.
And so I love, that's when things begin to really shape your culture, when language and stories begin to help shape our behavior. And it becomes really powerful, because now it's going back to, we talk about those early days, a small team, culture's caught. But that lack of proximity quickly means we've got to start teaching what's important, from caught to taught. We've got to start teaching what's important to us. But then as we're teaching it, and as they're beginning to live into it, now they're modeling it, so it's caught and it's taught. And
Yeah,
that's what you're hoping for inside of a great culture, is that the who we are and how we work together, we've put enough definition and clarity around that, and then built systems to consistently keep it in front of our team, so that they're both teaching it and they're catching it.
that's good. That's
So
good. Jenny, one of my I don't know, beliefs. One of my observations with pastors is we get bored real quickly. And so we think we've got to constantly change language, or we've got to change the processes that we're working with. And I
sure.
think that's, I don't know if it's one of the biggest destructors of culture, but I think it
Mm,
it sometimes hurts us so much because we're afraid to tell the same story over and over. And for
yes.
35 years, 34, 32 years that I was at LCBC, I told many of the same stories again and again, and I would say to the church, "So you've heard me say this before," and we just tell the same story, and they loved it. And you kind of roll your eyes and go, "Oh, here we go again." But there's something about repeating the same stories, not always thinking you have to do something new or say it differently.
Yeah.
I think there's value in that. So
Yeah, yeah, I love that you point that out, David, because that's the tension of any communicator, is that, we don't want to feel like we're saying the same thing, or somebody's starting to finish our sentences. But in actuality, when people, when you're telling a story to a congregation, to your staff, and you say, I know I've told you this before, but the ones who remember it are like, oh yeah, and they feel a connection to the, oh, I know where you're going with this, or gosh, I
Yeah.
forgot, but I love that story. So in actuality, the people listening, whether it's staff or congregation, whatever it might be, they find themselves in that story. There's a connection there,
Yeah.
because it's familiar. And then the people who maybe haven't heard it yet, you're bringing them along, and they're brought into some of that history. And so there's actually so much value in that. But we have to remind ourselves that no, it's okay that I've told that before. It's okay,
Yeah.
it's okay for me to say that again. I had the girl who does my marketing for our team. She's doing some ongoing learning and development because that's one of our core values at Foresight. She was telling me the other day that she's learning about, there used to be this rule of 7 in marketing
Hmm.
where, you had to have 7 impressions before somebody really hears something. Well, now in today's culture, because of all of the ways we get bombarded with information, that's now 23 times. Like
Really?
somebody
Wow.
has to hear something or be have an impression 23 times before they hear that message. So that
Wow.
even tells me even more as a
Yeah.
communicator that not abandoning stories too quickly or not being afraid to say something again, because there's so much noise coming at people that sometimes our consistency in our messaging actually has the greatest chance of
Yeah.
breaking through.
No, that's
Sorry,
good.
that's
That's
a
good.
little tangent, but it's
Yeah, no, that's right,
fascinating.
and that's amazing, 23, because I've always heard I was taught the 7 as well, and so I've always
Yeah.
stuck to that, but man, that's incredible. Yeah,
It doesn't surprise me when you think about just all the noise we get and all that from all the different channels, but it's like
yeah.
also
And
it's a
yeah, we
lot.
say it 2 or 3 times. I mean, it's the same kind of thing we experience with our worship leaders where, for there was a season where we were doing 6, 7 gatherings a weekend, and so by the time they did rehearsal on Thursday night, rehearsal before the weekend, and then they did it 6 or 7 times, they would be tired of a song by the 2nd or 3rd time they'd sung it, weekend we'd sung it, and we're going,
Uh-huh.
"Most of us have sung it 1 time, you sung it 30 times,"
That's
and so
right.
just, yeah, so anyway. Jenny,
Yep.
what would be some signs of an unhealthy culture? So you talked about
Mhm.
communication,
Yeah.
breakdown in communication. Are there other signs that somebody ought to be watching for to say, "Ooh, this isn't good"?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think anything that indicates maybe some disengagement or some complacency, that's always a big caution flag for me. If silos or people kind of doing their own thing, that's always a big indicator. Um, the uh, and often what I find, David, is that one of the big um, pain points in culture is that a lot of times there's a lack of clarity, meaning I don't know my role or my responsibilities, or maybe we changed some things. This happened a lot over the last few years, and we changed a lot of strategies, shifted job responsibilities, but didn't actually come back and clarify, this is how we work now. Here's the new
Mhm.
structure. Here's your new role or responsibilities. We kind of just all settled into it. And then what I was seeing is some disengagement or some complacency, a little bit of quiet quitting, has been a fancy phrase the last couple of
Yeah.
years. And what we often think it's an attitude problem, but what I'm finding is it's a clarity problem.
Mm.
In that somewhere, now we might have the outlier where it's an attitude problem,
Right.
or, maybe they just are not as aligned with the mission and direction. But more often, what I find is it's a lack of clarity. And the more confusion an employee has, and this would be true of volunteers as well, the more confusion there is about what I should be doing or how I can contribute in a meaningful way, the more they disengage. The
Mm.
more clarity they have, the more confidently they contribute. And that's one of the biggest things that I see in a lot of organizations where it's just like something's a little off, right? Like we're just not 100% sure, because we know the big ones of like if there's gossip and there's high turnover, typically
Right.
by that point our culture is in a really bad place.
Right.
And often sadly that's when I most get called to do culture work, is when it's that
Really
far
bad.
gone.
Yeah.
And you're like, "Oh gosh," because there's so much that's drifting earlier than that we just are maybe missing. And a lot of times it comes down to just some clarity things, some organizational clarity pieces where even with my team over the past year, it was the recognition that I needed to come back and really help cast vision for our next 5 years.
Mm.
I thought I got it. I thought I understood it. And then via a couple of conversations with team members, I was like, okay, nope, it's time for us to really kind of sit down and like, what's the vision for the next 5 years for our organization and how we're serving leaders? And so it look for those symptoms of um, the team member who used to be really engaged, who's just kind of just feels a little off. Um, look for the uh, and another piece of the puzzle that has impacted a lot of teams is we now have a little more flexibility in our work schedules, and we might not have everybody in the office 100% of the time.
Yeah,
There's variations on that, but that lack of proximity has also impacted culture. So
very
now
much.
we have to be much more intentional with, okay, when we are together, how are we making the most of that time? And so that's challenging leaders to say, okay, because relationships build trust. Trust is core to healthy culture. And
Yeah.
so we have to go back to, okay, flexible work schedules, a little more flexibility is just part of what we do now, and to varying degrees, but being really clear about that. What is our expectation? Because that has been another one that's created a hiccup for cultures. Is if certain people think we have to be in the office full time. Some people are taking liberties with that, and there's no clarity given from leadership of like what is the expectation. That starts to create rifts and tensions. So there's a myriad of things that
Yeah.
can impact it, but anywhere where there's a lack of clarity is where I would say, hey, put some energy there because that's a great starting point.
Yeah, and at least my experience, you just start feeling little rumblings of different situations that you're not sure
Yes.
where they're coming from, and you can just tell something's off. And I
Yep.
think the tendency is to want to just kind of assume it's going to get better. But I like again where you
There you go.
started was intentionality and saying, okay, let's jump in. And if you see something, feel something that's off, then jump into it right away. Don't assume it's going to get better because it's not.
Yeah.
And you can head it off before you get to the point where you said we have to call you and come in and solve our issues for us. So
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the hard truth that I think leaders need to hear is that the culture is never as good as we think it is. If you're in a senior leadership seat, you are the last to know that your culture is not in a great place.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
you first of all, it's hard for bad news to blow up. Typically we hear some of that stuff last. But we also are shaping the experience we're having. So whatever experience we're having with the culture, well, we have a lot of control over that. The rest of
Yeah.
the team don't have as much. They have influence on the culture, but they don't have as much agency to help shape or change it. And so oftentimes we're not aware of like you said, those little rumblings. So if you hear a little rumble, it's probably even more than a little
Bigger than
rumble.
that.
It's a
Yeah.
little big. Assume it because then it's good news if it's less than what you thought.
Yeah.
But put the curiosity hat on and start, seeking out some just some feedback and get some input from the team. I'm a big advocate of having regular rhythms for feedback,
Mhm.
be annual surveys for your staff. Obviously, performance reviews and good systems for all of those things are really important. But the more consistent feedback mechanisms you have, the more you're getting that input on a regular basis. And then you can also determine when something's not quite right. When you
Yeah.
see movement that's like, gosh, we used to, score really high on that question, and all of a sudden we're not. If you just survey when you finally hear all the rumblings, then you have no benchmark
Yeah.
for what you look like in a healthier place. So again, the more proactive, this is my personal mission, David, is if I could get more leaders being proactive to define and build a plan for their culture, just like you build a plan for your strategy every year. If you were intentional to define the culture you aspire to and build the plan to help you consistently live into it, then you won't need me.
Yeah.
you
That's
know
great.
and yeah. Yeah.
And Jenny, in your book, you do lay out structure or lay out plans, and you give more specifics, don't you? So talk a little bit about your book and the title of the book and why it would be beneficial for a pastor to pick it up.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's called Culture Matters, a framework for helping your team grow, thrive, and be unstoppable.
Is it out
And
now? Has
it
it been
comes
released?
it releases February 11th.
Okay.
So
All
I'm
right.
not sure exactly when this episode airs, but it releases February 11th, 2025. If this airs before then, we have pre-orders and you can get all kinds of bonuses. But it basically lays out, there's 5 phases to the framework where we help you assess your current culture, just what's true. Like, let's just get honest about where we are. Let's define what we aspire to. So, what is that aspiration? And I lay out that values grid and some other tools to help you get clear on what you're aspiring to. building the plan. And that's where we take you through. I think sometimes that's the mystery for so many leaders is, well, how do you build a plan for culture? Because it feels relational. Well, you'd be really surprised that most of your organizational rhythms create the opportunity for the plan. It's not that you have to layer on another whole new system. It's that you look at what you're already doing and you're more intentional with leaning into the culture you've defined. So we lay that out for you. Then it's equipping, that we know leaders influence culture. And so how are we equipping our leaders at every level to reinforce the best of who we are? And then the fifth phase is just committing to the ongoing work, because culture isn't an episodic thing. I had one organization that I was working with that had a really bad annual survey. And the senior leader looked at the HR person and said, okay, can you go do a workshop and fix that? And I was like, no, that's not going to fix it.
We wish, but
we wish that it was a one-time thing, but it really is a commitment to, again, it's a stewardship thing, right? Of the intentional stewardship of the health of your team. And so the fifth part of the process is just helping equip you with how do you consistently stay after this and commit to the work. So it really lays it out. Like, this is the work we do if I come in and work with an organization, but we've basically given you the playbook. And then, of course, we can support anywhere around that. But it does help you be much more proactive about building a team that is growing, thriving, and unstoppable and achieving the mission.
That's great. And guys, what I loved about Jenni's book, it really is a framework. It just was so practical. And I think that anybody can pick up the book and it will improve your organization if you follow what Jenni is saying there. So much so I enjoyed it that I did ask Jenni to come and speak at Base Camp, what we call for the Global Leadership Summit. And just wanted our pastors to be able to hear it there, because I think it's incredibly relevant to where we are as churches, as leaders, and very, very helpful. So Jenni, thank you for spending time with us today. Appreciate that very much. Thanks for the work that you're doing to help churches and pastors. Appreciate that very much. And
Thank you so much, David.
yeah, and appreciate what you're doing. Is there a way they can get a hold of you if they want to get a hold of you?
Yes, two quick things. culturemattersbook.com is where you can find all of the book information and all the bonus materials and et cetera. So culturemattersbook.com. And then you can just email me at jenni@getforesight.com. It's JENNI at getforesight, GET, the number 4, SIGHT. And if I can support you in any way, getforesight.com is our main website. So lots of resources there, my podcast, articles and blog posts, free downloads, lots of stuff there to just support you in your ministry work. So thank you.
That's great. Yeah, Jenni, thank you for taking time with us. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
And
thank you.
Look forward to seeing you at Base Camp, if not before. So
Thank you for listening to the Advantage Podcast with David Ashcraft and for participating in our goal to strengthen and encourage pastors and their churches so more people are introduced to Jesus across Pennsylvania. If you found this helpful, feel free to pass it along. To find out more about the work of The Advantage, visit our website at theadvantage.org.